Hi, this is Dark Journalist. Today I have quite a show for you. Legendary UFO investigator, nuclear physicist, and best-selling author Stanton Friedman will join us for a rare, in-depth interview on MJ-12, UFO technology, decades of covert manipulation and official cover-ups that are well detailed in his classic work, Top Secret, Magic. Today we'll examine why, decades after the famous MJ-12 documents were leaked by a whistleblower, there are increasing efforts to discredit them by intelligence agencies and even other UFO researchers. Now, Stanton has sometimes been referred to as the godfather of ufology, and the title suits him well. From Roswell to MJ-12, his scientific credentials have given a tremendous lift to the credibility of UFO and alien technology research. Today we're going to find out how he feels about covert groups trying to steal back some of that progress. I'll give you a hint, he's not too pleased about it. Here we go. Nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, UFOs, MJ-12, and covert cover-ups.
Many of the things that people think they saw correlate perfectly with Air Force research projects.
You're confident that you're not part of any cover-up, wittingly or unwittingly?
I'm totally confident, but I think Colonel Weaver, you might have seen him on TV earlier, said it best. We can't even keep single secrets. How could we have a conspiracy or a cover-up?
Now, you realize the Air Force has lied every minute. Now, the CIA, I can give you dozens of pages that are blacked out, and I get people telling me the government can't keep secrets. Okay, tell me what's under the blackout. The United States recovered a crash-flying saucer, and you got wreckage, you got bodies that proves we're being visited, case closed. I mean, that's the end of it.
You know, it's easy to imagine sometimes that our knowledge of the world is always growing. But what if a covert intel program exists to reverse that process and has been trying to cast doubt on the progress that pioneers in the field of UFO research have been making in the past 50 years? That's what's happening in the case of the MJ-12 documents. Through the efforts of disinformation movies like Mirage Men, which purport to show that major UFO cases were simply dreamed up by members of Air Force intelligence, there's a renewed effort to discredit some key discoveries that show not only official secrecy, but official intimidation. The MJ-12 documents are in the middle of a propaganda battle. Now we're going to get the real story. Stan, it's great to have you here. First off, I wanted to ask you how you're doing. Now, I know you had a health scare last summer, and everyone wants to know how you're feeling now.
Well, yeah, I had a heart attack on June 27th, and I broke my string for the first time in my life. I went 79 years and 11 months without being overnight in a hospital.
Wow.
And I had a heart attack, so I spent a week in a hospital and had a couple of stents put in, and I'm doing fine. And, for an 80-year-old, I figured I got 10 more years. My parents both lived to be 90, so.
Well, that's great to hear. We're all relieved that you're doing better and wish you many more healthy years. And it's excellent to have you back.
Well, I'm glad to be back. I've given a number of lectures the past few months, and I've got a bunch more scheduled, so.
Excellent.
Life goes on.
Yes. You're ready to roll.
Ready to roll.
So let's start off with this Majestic 12 group, better known as MJ-12.
Okay.
Now, these documents, which you helped bring to light, I think represent some of the biggest, most important breakthroughs on understanding the government cover-up on the UFO topic. Just to get us all on the same page, can you describe for us what MJ-12 was and who were some of the participants on it, and why are these documents so important?
Well, okay. If you go back to 1947, Roswell happened in July, early July. First newspaper article is July 8th. Okay. It turns out, if we accept the reality of Majestic 12, Magic 12, MJ 12, whatever you want to call it, which I do, having spent an enormous amount of time trying to prove that it's a fraud, and I have been unable to do that.
Right.
In September, President Truman established a group called Operation Majestic 12. He gave instructions to Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. Let's go ahead with Majestic 12 was basically what he said. And we got, fast forward, nobody knew anything about that on the outside. It was totally accountable only to the president, that enabling letter to Forrestal said.
And that's the highest level.
That's it. And we didn't find out. In 1984, at the end of 84, we got a roll of film Jamie Chandray got in California. I was working with Jamie and with Bill Moore. Bill and I had done a lot of work on Roswell. I'm the original civilian investigator. Bill and I we found 62 people in a year and a half once we got rolling on that. And the first book came out in 1980.
Wow.
By 1986, we had found it was up to 92 people.
Yeah.
Hard work before the internet. Big phone bills.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of big phone bills.
Now, Stan, you broke the Roswell story, and most of the facts and witnesses around this iconic UFO case actually come from your early research on the topic. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I broke the Roswell story, and I was the first to find Walter Haut and General Dubose and Bill Brazel, the son of the rancher, and so forth. And, I've been at almost all, not quite all. I missed last year's Roswell Festival because of the heart attack.
Yeah.
But, and so we get this, an associate, Jamie Chandray, got a roll of film in the mail on which was the Eisenhower briefing document dated November 24th, 1952. And it was a briefing for the president-elect. Eisenhower got elected in 52. It was in 52. And he didn't take office until January 53.
Right.
So he was the president-elect when this thing came out.
He's in that in-between period there.
Yeah. And if anything had happened to the country, all the decisions would have been made by Truman, not by Ike. President-elect doesn't carry any weight.
Right.
And of course, Ike had been in Europe for most of the previous 2 years with an impossible job, which he managed to get done. Many people don't appreciate. Here, his job is to unite the forces of good against the forces of evil, the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
That means working France, England, the United States with Germany, which we'd fought 2 wars with.
Right.
And where there was, a lot of people got killed in that war and got bombed. We bombed the heck out of Europe.
Oh, yeah.
And Ike's job was to blend the Allied forces with Germany. And he did it. And not many other people could have. I'm absolutely certain. General Montgomery of England couldn't have done it. And France was in terrible shape anyway, and so forth. Anyway, we get this roll of film in the mail to a colleague, and Bill developed the roll of film, 35 millimeter film. It was postmarked Albuquerque, which is not surprising. Albuquerque is the big city in that area. That's where Los Alamos is close to, but Kirtland Air Force Base, Sandia, which is one of the nuclear weapons labs. So Albuquerque was the center of activities. And people forget, first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And the bomb was supplied by the Roswell base. They dropped the first 2 atomic bombs on Japan, the 509. And they came back to be based at Roswell. So this wasn't a bunch of dinks with nothing else to do.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious how you actually discovered who was in this MJ-12 group.
This briefing for Ike included a list of the 12 members of MJ-12.
Uh-huh.
And it was an outstanding group. There was one surprise on it, but basically it included the first 3 directors of Central Intelligence, a bunch of generals, General Vandenberg, for example, General Twining, an outstanding group with some Navy people, and 5 scientists, and one, the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal.
I see, yeah.
Okay. So it was an all-star cast, but there was one surprise. Listed on the group was Dr. Donald Menzel. He was a Harvard University professor of astronomy.
Okay.
So he was an outstanding scientist, well-known. The only trouble is he'd written 3 anti-UFO books.
Ah.
And so you say, how could he be on such a list?
Right.
And that was a real shocker, because everybody else we knew had a high-level security clearance. And if you're going to be on something on a top-secret document that's accountable only to the president, you got to have a high-level security clearance.
Yes.
And you don't need a high-level security clearance to teach astronomy at Harvard.
Uh-huh.
And so there was the real puzzle, was how is this? We didn't want to go public with this. Somebody'd say, gotcha.
Right. Right.
What, are you kidding, Menzel?
Yeah.
And 3 anti-UFO books he'd written. He was the noisiest negativist in the 50s and 60s. No question about it.
Stan, I like the name you use for these debunker guys, noisy negativists. That's pretty good.
That's my pleasant name for them.
So Donald Menzel was one of the names that stood out for you because his presence in a group like this was intriguing, given his background as a Harvard astronomer and as a UFO skeptic.
Yeah, which seemed totally incredulous to all of us. Only a few of us knew about this at the time.
Uh-huh.
But so the others were not surprises. We had been digging around because of Roswell to see who were the big shots at that time.
Right.
And all that stuff. And one of the other people on the list was Vannevar Bush. He was basically President Roosevelt's science advisor. That wasn't the title.
Okay.
But he coordinated about 80 different high-tech research and development programs. That included the atomic bomb project.
Wow.
The proximity fuse, stuff like that. And so he was an obvious choice. And there were outstanding scientists, but I was looking at, I spend a lot of time at archives.
Uh-huh.
I believe you got to get firsthand information and to get a handle on what's going on. I've been to 20 archives, some of them for a week, Eisenhower Library, for example.
Oh, nice.
And, if somebody paid me, I'd spend full time doing that.
Right. Yeah.
But you don't get access to highly classified material. But when you get out a list of file folders, you tell them which boxes you want. And then when you're going through those, you'll find withdrawal sheets. It says 2-page memo, Jones to Smith, this date, top secret. So you can file a request for that. That's all you see. You don't know what's on it. But
interesting.
And it can take you 2 years to 6 years to get
that's a long time,
believe it or not. So you're looking, and I had found at the Library of Congress Manuscript Division in Van Bush's papers something under the title Menzel. And I looked at that, and lo and behold, there was a strange letter from a big shot legal firm in Boston to Van Bush saying, thanks for all your help. And as I promised, I'm informing you that Donald was cleared of all charges against him.
Uh-huh.
They had wanted to take away his Air Force security clearance. So that question was, what clearance? Why did Menzel need a clearance with the Air Force?
Yeah, right.
Security clearance. I knew he'd been in the Navy during the war, but the war was over. He was a commander in the Navy. That's not the Air Force as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And so I called the legal firm. All these guys were dead, you see, so there was no way to get firsthand input from any of them.
Yeah, well, we're talking about 30 years later, right?
Well, yeah, I'm looking at this in 1984, 85.
Okay.
The document supposedly was written in the briefing document in 52.
All right, so about 32 years after.
Different cast of characters.
Yeah.
And it turns out that we got strange directions, but in Van Bush's file is this lawyer letter. I called the legal firm, and they said, oh, yeah, there's 1,000 pages of information over at the Harvard Archives.
Ah.
It took permission from 3 different people for me to gain access to those. Written permission. I don't play around there.
Right, sure.
I got a research grant from the Fund for UFO Research, thank you, guys, from Washington, which one guy named Milton William Cooper said, oh, that was all CIA money, and Friedman works for the CIA, which was one of those, where's my check?
Well, this is the kind of knee-jerk reaction that we see over and over again, where when you're working on these really deep secrets and you come across something that's truly groundbreaking, there's always a chorus of critics who'll line up and say, well, he's probably an intel agent spreading disinformation, right? So you can't win.
Yeah, stuff like that. And I know the history of my grant because the fund had put out a mailing to the people that it was connected to. Which of these research topics would you like researched? And MJ12 was tops on the list. And so they came to me and said, Stan, can you do any research on this? Yeah, I got all kinds of things I can do. Well, prepare a proposal, which I did. And they gave me a grant, and that enabled me to go down to Harvard, spend 3 nights there, and then go down to the Forrestal's papers in Princeton, and to go to Washington. And it takes money to do these
Sure.
things. I'm not rich. Certainly don't get rich being a ufologist. Via that. And so I went to Harvard, and I better tell you, I'd had one run-in with Menzel.
Okay.
I was speaking to an engineering alumni group at Harvard back in the late 60s. And I was there, and I called him early in the day because I had no idea whether they were promoting the program outside of their membership. So I called out of courtesy. I called Dr. Menzel. This is Don Menzel. I said, hi, this is Stanton Friedman. Oh, I know all about you. I said, oh, you saw my congressional paper next to yours? No, I've seen letters and memos.
That's interesting.
I didn't know what that meant at that time at all. I just found out 2 months ago what that meant. It turns out that I'd had some correspondence with Edward U. Condon, the Condon Report.
Sure, the Condon Committee.
Yeah. And it turned out that Kathleen Marden was doing research. I was supposed to be with her, but I was in the hospital. At the American Philosophical Society Library, which is where Condon's papers were.
Okay.
And Menzel has papers there, too, his UFO correspondent.
Right, yeah.
And Phil Klass has papers there, too, which, interestingly, don't have a Friedman file, even though we corresponded for more than 20 years.
Now, Philip Klass was a major UFO debunker.
A big debunker. Nasty, noisy, negativist, indeed.
Yeah, he sort of set the trend.
Well, Menzel before him.
Right, exactly.
Menzel earlier. Menzel was older. And I found out that Condon had sent copies of my rather strong letters to him to Menzel.
Oh, okay. And you've only just recently discovered this, right?
A few weeks ago.
Wow, that's
well,
unreal.
Kathy discovered in July.
Well, that shows that they were really keeping tabs on you.
Yeah, what letters and memos. But the rest of the conversation was interesting. And I didn't know what that meant. And he said, you can't be a scientist and believe in UFOs, said Menzel.
Mm-hmm.
At which stupid comment, I laughed. And he got angry. He started ranting. I said, Dr. Menzel, I only called out of courtesy to invite you to attend my lecture tonight at such and such a time, such and such a building, because I had no idea whether you were aware of it or not. And I didn't say it, but what I was thinking was, I don't want anybody to think I was afraid to tangle with you.
Right.
So that was our conversation. So I was not a fan of Donald Menzel.
Okay.
So here I am at Harvard, and I'm looking around, what am I going to look for? And I see a file. I knew that his correspondence was at the American Philosophical Society Library, Menzel's UFO correspondence. And there's a file that says JFK.
Uh-huh.
Let's check that.
Really? Yeah.
I was shocked because in there, it turns out Kennedy was on the board of overseers at Harvard.
Okay.
And his area of interest was the astronomy field. And his contact was Don Menzel. They got to know each other. I mean, Kennedy's from the Boston area,
Yeah.
Not too surprising. And in these letters, I found Menzel saying to Kennedy, and they're on a first-name basis, Dear Jack, that kind of thing. There's one area where I might be able to be of some assistance to you, the National Security Agency. I have a longer continuous association with them and their Navy predecessor of anybody in the country. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more.
Wow.
Well,
yeah.
Shock.
Right.
And then it turned out, I also looked at his then unpublished autobiography. Turns out he'd done classified work for 30 different companies. He was a world-class cryptographer.
Huh.
Nobody knew any of this stuff.
Yeah.
He done work for the FBI and the CIA, and the charges were, this was part of the McCarthy era.
Right, yeah.
The hearing was 1950. And one of the things he was guilty of, he led an eclipse expedition in Siberia. Well, that makes him a communist sympathizer.
Oh, no. Just because he was over
Yeah,
there.
like he arranged for the eclipse to be there, visible there.
But it sounds like he was leading a double life.
He was leading a double life. And Van Bush testified strongly in his favor. It turns out they'd gone back as they knew each other since 1934. Close. Well, Bush was at MIT. He was at Harvard. So they're
Long-term relationship.
Yeah, long-term relationship. And it was clear from Bush's testimony on his behalf that he knew what Menzel had been doing. This is an unclassified presentation, but it was clear he was familiar with his work and so forth. So this opened up a whole new ball game. And as a matter of fact, within the last couple of years, there's been a big, long paper published about his contributions to cryptology. Would you believe?
Well, isn't that interesting? Because they're starting to understand now and get on board with some of the research that you found out about a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a real shocker. And I still get people saying he couldn't have led a double life. And I always say Burgess, Philby, and McLean. These are three English intelligence agency guys who were Russian spies.
Uh-huh.
That's a pretty neat trick.
Yeah.
But Menzel he set up the teaching program at Radcliffe, the women's part of Harvard.
Yeah.
They wanted to use women because the men would be at war. This is during the war. They needed more people to work on cryptography because, after all, we'd broken the German codes and Japanese codes.
Right.
So you need people to, and one of the things that Menzel had going for him is he learned Japanese. He made trips to New Mexico. Would have been the ideal guy to look at the symbols on the wreckage from Roswell.
Oh, yeah.
Strange symbols. What do they mean? Well, you go to a cryptographer,
Right, exactly.
So it opened up a whole new ball game. And a good example of what people didn't know, Sky and Telescope, which is published in the Boston area, devoted 2 issues to Don Menzel in his honor.
Uh-huh.
The first one at the time of Menzel's death.
Okay.
And the second one at the 100th anniversary of his birth. In neither of these do they say anything at all about his post-World War II highly classified activities.
That's so odd.
Nobody knew about them. I talked to people at Harvard. Most of them didn't even know about the loyalty hearings,
Huh.
which Menzel described as the worst experience of his life. He had a Navy top secret Umbra, and he couldn't say anything about it. And here the Air Force wants to take away his secret clearance.
Yeah.
For no good reason at all.
Yeah.
So I suddenly became a fan of Don Menzel. And I just reread his congressional testimony in 1968. We both provided only written testimony. There were 6 guys who gave oral testimony. And there's an interesting contrast. Menzel tries to explain away all sightings with broad generalizations. Not one reference in his paper. I've got more than 40 references in my paper.
Oh, that's great.
And right next to him, I'm saying the evidence is overwhelming. Some UFOs are alien spacecraft. We're dealing with a cosmic Watergate. And there's no problem with interstellar flight if you want to spend the money. And Menzel says, with the nearest civilization being hundreds of light years away, which is a crock of baloney. And this is before Kepler, of course, saying there's planets all over the place. But there are 2,000 stars within 54 light years of here. Why would you have to worry about going hundreds of light years?
Right.
It makes no sense, but it sounds good. You can't get here from there, and there aren't any good cases, and people are lousy observers. That was his notion.
Yeah, and because he was an expert, everyone was just supposed to forget about it.
Well, yeah, Dr. J. Allen Hynek actually favorably reviewed one of Menzel's 3 UFO books.
Yeah, but Hynek turned at a certain point. He just couldn't take the lies anymore.
Turned.
Yeah.
Well, Allen was a good guy. Menzel was aggressive. Allen was not. And there is still, today as we speak. There are still people who are afraid to get involved in investigating UFOs.
Sure.
Because fear of ridicule. Witnesses are afraid to report them because fear of ridicule.
Yeah, so the psychological resistance to this is strong because they place this barrier out there for serious academic people not to go near this area. It's kind of like the third rail. But in terms of MJ-12, I guess my question is, where are they now? And do you think that this special group is still operating in the government today?
Well, I'm sure it's still around. I'm sure the title got changed when the documents got leaked.
Yes.
Because that's standard practice. And I think that there are some opponents of the notion of MJ-12. There's about 100 phony documents out there. I say there are 3 genuine ones. That's all I care about. Would you expect the government to flood the market with garbage? If good stuff gets out? Well, this is garbage and that's garbage, so it must all be garbage.
Right.
And that's the attitude I'm running into. And there is an old ploy. Absence of evidence is evidence for absence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it isn't. Very often it is not. And so I've gone systematically through all the objections to the 3 MJ-12 documents, and I haven't found one that stands up. Some of them are silly. Philip Klass, who was a nasty, noisy negativist to the nth degree.
Right, yeah.
He challenged me that perhaps you didn't realize that one of those documents was done in large pica type, but the National Security Council uses only small elite type. And I will give you $100 each for every genuine document done in the same size and style pica type, up to a maximum of 10, unfortunately. Now, he'd never been to the Eisenhower Library before or after. They have 250,000 pages of National Security Council materials. How can anybody assume you can go from, he had 9, then you can go from 9 to 250,000? That's pretty absurd.
Oh, yeah.
When I went, I sent him 14 and an invoice for $1,000, and he paid me. He didn't tell anybody about paying me.
That's great. Now, Stan, I have a vintage clip here of you tangling with Philip Klass, and this is from ABC's Nightline program. Looks like an early attempt at discrediting these MJ-12 documents, and it's always interesting to see and go back and compare how debunking was used then versus some of the disinformation attempts that are going on now. So here we go.
And an enormous amount of data in the form of documents, some of them obtained from the government directly, some not so directly, clearly indicating that our planet is being visited, that some UFOs are alien spacecraft, and that we are indeed dealing with a cosmic Watergate.
Let me respond, if I may, to an issue that's come up here that I think is a very important one. These alleged top-secret, eyes-only documents provide ABC, provide the nation, an opportunity to find out for themselves firsthand what sort of nonsense the UFO proponents are spouting.
Let me comment about that. One thing I am familiar with is I worked on classified programs for 15 years. I had a high-level security clearance. And essentially everybody I've talked to who also has had high-level security clearances agrees fully with the notion that secrets are being kept, that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of so-called black programs.
Either these documents are authentic, we have captured a flying saucer, the government has maintained a cover-up for 40 years, or come back and report it's nonsense and there has never been so great a con job done against the news media and the public as has been perpetrated with the release of these phony documents.
Stan, it looks like they were after you even then.
That's right.
So why do you think there's this big push on now to try and discredit the MJ-12 documents? You know, the heat is on and the pressure is rising, but where is it coming from? You know, we see efforts like this movie Mirage Men, which tries to cast major UFO cases in a negative light and just say, oh, that's the Air Force, you know, covering for their experimental craft, and even enlisting guys like Kevin Randall, for example, who's in the military, to say, oh, yeah, MJ-12 is just a hoax.
I don't know. I think it may be a strong not invented here attitude. You know, if that were real, I would have known about it. And I've already stuck my neck out, so I might as well get it out a little farther. Yeah, I read the Mirage book and saw the movie.
Okay.
And it was full of baloney.
Right, exactly.
It was written by an Englishman. Got nothing against Englishmen, but he spent a lot of time in New Mexico, but he didn't really understand how security works.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't. It's funny how people are ready to, everything is automatically declassified after 20 years. Some people. That's not true. I know it's not true because I've been to places where there's old stuff that they won't declassify.
And of course, you search for and get these rare documents, and when you get them, they're all blacked out and redacted.
Well, the NSA never says anything, no such agency. Those guys, Mr. Snowden's company, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
They released, many years ago, 156 top secret Umbra UFO documents. The only trouble is, you can only read one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out.
Whoa.
Whited out.
Oh, whited out.
Yeah, not blacked out. Now, the CIA, I can give you dozens of pages that are blacked out except for, a few words per page. And I get people telling me the government can't keep secrets. Okay, tell me what's under the whiteout. It's very straightforward. And that goes back. These date from like 1980. So what are all the documents that they've accumulated since that time? So I think there's a territoriality thing. Nobody likes to admit they're wrong. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But I'll be doing more writing about MJ-12 and Operation Majestic 12. Some of the arguments are pretty silly. One of Kevin's early argument was that the briefing officer is described as Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter. He had been head of the CIA. But he wasn't an admiral. He was only a rear admiral. Obviously, the document's fraudulent. What he didn't point out, as he should have, the other 5 military people all were named by generic ranks. General and admiral. Not lieutenant general, not major general, including Ike's staff secretary. He used to list who was attending meetings at the White House.
Okay.
And he would list them all by generic rank, including himself. General. He signed it Brigadier General.
Right.
I checked with 2 archivists. Does that bother you, this use of generic? Standard practice. And they tell me Ike used it in his books. And I went and looked, and sure enough, he did. So Kevin made a big deal about this. Obviously nonsense. And what he said was obvious nonsense.
Yeah. Well, what I find strange is that he's a UFO researcher.
Well, remember, he's written at least 80 books of fiction, besides the few books of nonfiction.
Okay, well, that's a good point, actually.
He creates scenarios.
Right, yeah.
I don't know how to create scenarios. I got to go by the facts. I got to have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear.
Yes.
So there's a whole bunch of these things that sound good but turn out to be false. Objected to the MJ-12 stuff.
Okay, so let's go one level deeper with this. What is it that's revealed in the MJ-12 documents, if you were to summarize it, that scares the establishment and elements of the research community so much? What is it that critics object to exactly?
I don't know why people object, because they didn't get there first. I don't know what it is. But the fundamental thing that's revealed is that the United States recovered a crash flying saucer and enemy bodies in 1947.
Alien bodies.
Alien bodies.
Yes.
And you got wreckage, you got bodies that proves we're being visited, and case closed. I mean, that's the end of it. And we're not telling the Russians, we're not telling the Chinese, we're not telling the American people, because you can't tell the Americans without telling the Chinese and the Russians.
Right.
But I mean, it establishes the baseline in 1947. This is a briefing for Ike. And I'm sure he knew about it in 47 because he was Army Chief of Staff for a while. And then he became president of Columbia University, and then he went over to Europe. So I'm not saying he didn't know about it. But by 1952, he certainly needed a briefing between 47 and 52. A lot could happen in 5 years, especially when you look at the list of attachments. It's only really 8 pages long, the Eisenhower briefing document. It says preliminary on it. Another objection. Oh, you think there was a crash in Aztec, New Mexico, which I do, because I've looked at Scott Ramsey's and his wife Suzanne's excellent work on
Oh,
it.
yeah.
But it isn't mentioned in the briefing, so you can't have it both ways. It says it's a preliminary briefing. It doesn't say this is the whole story. Ike was briefed at the Pentagon for 48 minutes to cover all the subjects he was being briefed on. You're not going to give a life history of all these things. You give him one document, and then he appoints somebody to dig into this.
Uh-huh.
That's the way these things go. It was, this was November. He didn't become president for 2 months. January, he became president.
Right.
So that's in time to get things rolling. I should put out a whole book. There's a chapter in my book, Flying Saucers in Science, update on Majestic 12, which I bring into a lot of this stuff, the findings. And I just wish, it's like the Menzel stuff. I've had people say he couldn't have led a double life, but none of those people have gone to the Harvard archives to look at his papers.
Yeah.
I mean, don't tell me that I'm full of baloney when you haven't looked at the evidence. I don't make it up. Here it is. Yeah. So I don't understand it. But as I said in our book, Science Was Wrong. There are a lot of examples of smart people taking strong stands about things which they were totally wrong about.
Right. So really, the Majestic 12 documents are probably the clearest indication that we're being visited by off-world civilizations. And they basically show that the government is aware of their presence here and has taken steps to create a program around it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I think so. It's from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Right. Right.
And a lot of the stuff's coming out of the other end of the horse, I'm afraid. It touches a nerve for some reason. Part of it, I suppose, is because once people have taken a stand, they hate to admit they were going down the wrong pike.
Yeah. Well, do you think there are covert intelligence groups that are trying to, over time, discredit the MJ-12 documents and reverse the research on this to try and keep the public uninformed about UFOs?
Oh, yeah. It would be standard operating procedure. If something gets out that risks releasing classified data, you want to put out disinformation. The British did it all during the war. They turned certain German agents. And how important it is can be illustrated by the fact that we made a major effort to convince Hitler that the invasion of Europe, which everybody knew was going to happen sometime, was going to take place near Calais, France, rather than Normandy.
Right, yeah.
They even included documents, sort of innocuous, in the pocket of an English officer who had died. They dumped him off Spain, man without a face, and knowing that the Spanish would turn it over to Hitler. All kinds of subtle things were done.
That's interesting.
Well, if you want it, being able to deceive your enemy is extremely important when you have a limited amount of troops, equipment, capability, and stuff. Hitler's generals told them, bring in the reserves. Come on, they're attacking over here. No, said Hitler. He knew better. This is not the real attack. That's going to happen over at Calais. The time he sent in the troops, it was too late.
Yeah.
So we've learned that this information can be very powerful.
Absolutely.
And, that's the way things are. I mean, if people say, oh, it's terrible. Government's lying. Well, I hate to say it. Yeah, governments do lie.
Yeah.
This isn't the first time.
Right. Well, what world have they been living in?
Yeah.
Well, when you look at the secretive system that's been set up around this kind of information, what is their chief reason for these attempts at discrediting the whole notion of MJ-12? Would it be to lower the public's knowledge about UFO phenomena? Because they want to reserve that information and all that it implies and keep it for themselves, basically.
Well, I think they want it to themselves, and they're concerned about our enemies overseas, too.
Okay.
And people say, well, don't you think we're entitled to know everything? No, I don't. I respect security.
Uh-huh.
And if we put our stuff out on the table and the Russians and Chinese don't put their stuff, maybe what they know with what we know would give them a leg up on us.
Interesting.
You can't do that.
And these other countries, like Russia and China, for example, have their own UFO files and secret research programs around it as well, right?
Oh, a great deal. Big countries. And loads of sightings over there in both China and Russia. And, India as well. The problem is what happens to the world if countries lose their special status.
Yeah.
If there's a push for, why don't we be friends with each other, folks? We got a lot of starving kids to feed. To me, that's a symbol of what's wrong with the planet.
Yes.
And I can't imagine aliens thinking that, those Earthlings are really nice guys. We're not.
Oh, there's no question. And it's funny, you do hear this a lot, that if the aliens were visiting, well, why wouldn't they speak to us officially? And I recall someone asked you that on one of these CNN debates, and you had a classic response. You said, well, I don't talk to the squirrels in my backyard, which I
That's right.
Good.
It's right. And, it sounds simplistic, but it's true. When you look at the huge investment, as I mentioned, the total black budget for military intelligence for the United States, according to the Washington Post, is $52.6 billion.
Wow, and that's just what we know about, right?
Yeah, that's black budget according to them, and I think there was a leak from Snowden about budget and something like that. But if back 25 years ago, it was almost $40 billion. The guy got a Pulitzer Prize for coming up with that number about the black budget. So this is taken very seriously.
Yeah.
Classified intelligence. It doesn't mean everybody gets to look at it, but nobody gets to take it home. It means you don't get to look at it. You don't have access. And that includes, the cosmic Watergate is why I call it that, because that wasn't even military secrets.
True.
But the Washington Post spent a lot of money to dig into that. And we need somebody to take Woodward Bernstein's place to blow the lid off the cosmic Watergate, as far as I'm concerned. I'd help.
Yeah, right. Well, you've been the best help so far. Stan, when you look at things like WikiLeaks and stuff, do you look at it hopefully and say maybe somewhere in that whole sort of milieu of stuff we're going to see some UFO revelations?
I'm not too optimistic about that. Compartmentalization is the key to security. That's why I mentioned Vannevar Bush. He was known for that.
Uh-huh.
Just because you work in the same building and have a top secret clearance doesn't mean you have access to what the guy next door is doing.
True.
That's how that means if you got a spy in your midst, he doesn't have access to everything, you see.
Yes.
Which is very important. And, I talk about spies and military budgets, but look at the planet we live on. Where does the money go? Everybody's got an Air Force. Everybody's got an Air Defense Command. Everybody's got armies, navies, huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
You got to protect your information. And so, it's a sad thing to say, but that's where the action is.
And so that could include this sort of press blackout, working through the media to keep it as a kind of third rail.
Yes.
Yeah, as something to report on seriously.
Yes. I think the government, when I say the government, that makes it sound like it's a monolithic structure and everybody knows what's going on.
Right.
That's not how security works.
Okay.
Only a few people know what's going on.
Yeah.
If you take advantage of the egos in Washington, well, if that were happening here, I'm important, I would know about it. No. That's the best reason for not telling you. You might be talking to the press.
I see what you mean.
Why don't presidents know everything that's going on? Why should they? They don't have a need to know, and they do meet the press all the time. It's part of their daily... They might be saying some wrong things.
Right.
Presidents come and go. Intelligence agencies go on forever. That's an old line out of Washington. So, like it or not, we don't get to vote on whether we like it or not.
Well, that's definitely true. Now, do you think that most of this advanced technology research from these crash retrievals has been transferred over to private industry? which has the effect of making it even harder to trace?
Well, look, if it's technology research, who's going to develop it? Some university? No, it's going to be private industry. Like I said, look at Lockheed for stealth.
Yeah, right.
And the rockets, you might have a NASA hither and yon, but the work gets done in industry. Who builds the boosters? It's industry.
Sure.
And so they're an important part of the thing. You'd never get academics to admit that. I've seen so much ignorance. Well, two different people have told me, Stan, if Roswell really happened, they'd have had to pull half the physicists out of the colleges in the country to deal with that. And I laughed and said, what are you talking about? Are you forgetting about Los Alamos and Sandia and Livermore and Oak Ridge and all these other places? There are two requirements. You need competent people who have high-level security clearances. And we have that in industry and the national labs. That's where the action is, not at universities. I'm not saying universities, MIT is still doing some classified work, a small amount by comparison.
But most of them would be out of the loop on this for sure. Definitely. It's such a naive point of view that they have.
Well, it would have been published in the Physical Review. I had one guy tell me about Roswell. I mean, the first nuclear chain reaction, Fermi's outfit at Chicago, 1942. It was an earth-shaking event.
Yeah.
There was publication about it.
Well, that reminds me, I seem to recall you were in a radio interview and someone called in and said, I was in the military and I never heard about a crashed UFO. And you said, well, why would they share that with you? Did you have top secret crash retrieval security clearance? And that really said a lot, I think.
Security clearance and need to know.
Need to know, exactly.
You need both. Some people think that everybody who's got a top secret clearance has access to all top secret material. No way.
Right.
That's not the way it works.
Well, it's very interesting. Actually, there's a lot of misconceptions about how secrecy is maintained by these organizations, and it's important to open our eyes and see how things really work. Now I want to ask you what, in your opinion, are the three most important UFO cases on the record that prove we're being visited by an extraterrestrial presence. What are your top three? And let's say besides Roswell, since you've already shown just how important that case is in your best-selling books on the subject. So what are your top three?
Well, I like the Betty and Barney Hill case, mainly because Dr. Simon was so skilled. We hear a lot about PTSD these days.
Sure.
He was a world-class expert on that. He actually ran an Army facility with 3,000 beds for veterans who had shell shock, is what they called it then.
Right.
PTSD. And he developed the techniques for getting them back to life, so to speak. And he said, he didn't know much about flying saucers at all, but he knew a great deal about having people get over traumatic experiences. And he had to stop one session each for Betty and Barney because he wasn't sure they could handle it. The terror was so obviously great.
Yeah.
And so coming from him, that means something. We're not talking about a parlor hypnotist. That, along with the fact that Betty and Barney were rather special people, in my opinion. I did meet them both.
Oh, that's right. You did.
Oh, yeah, of course. And the co-author on Capture, Kathleen Martin, is Betty's niece.
Yeah, she's a good writer.
So she heard about it the day after it happened because Betty called her sister, Kathy's mother, and told her about seeing a flying saucer. Now, the abduction part didn't come out for a couple of years.
Yes.
After Dr. Simon got involved. But I was the first to publish about the star map work.
Uh-huh.
You want a different sense of perspective. The base stars for the Hill aliens, if you will, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticulum.
Right, yeah.
So what? Well, they're only 39.3 light years away, which is close down the street, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But they're only an eighth of a light year apart from each other.
Ah.
So from a planet around one looking at the other, you can see it all day long. That's an entirely different situation. They're 30 times closer than we are. Our star is the next star over.
Huh.
So, and they're older. So it wouldn't be surprising if there were earlier interstellar travel when you had a next door neighbor.
Right, right.
So that's kind of intriguing.
And the upshot of the star map is that Betty Hill recounted it during a hypnotic regression and drew it. And it actually took another 5 years for information on that second star to even be published.
Well, Marjorie Fish, a brilliant woman, I was the first to publish about her work, built more than 20 three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood.
Amazing.
Using little beads and string to see if she could match the two-dimensional drawing that Betty had made. Only if she could remember it accurately. That was a kicker from Dr. Simon.
Yeah.
And so she finally kept eliminating stars and finally found one pattern that matched, angle for angle, line length for line length. It was a great day. And that's when we found out it was Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli.
Yeah, let's go to this clip from your original